Okay, it's 1 o'clock. Dawn, if you're listening, you can turn your site on. It's 1 o'clock on February 10th. This is the Board of Public Works rate study workshop. So all the board members are here, several staff members, Sharon and Kimberly, Robbins with Austin, and Josh. So Austin, do you want to start it off, and then you can turn it over to Dawn?
So just to kind of give a little bit of backstory, Dawn presented in July, right before Darren was getting ready to leave. And since then, we had some administrative changes. Bob retired, Rhett came in. Rhett has a different view on some capital perspectives on the electric side. So there were adjustments there. We had to adjust a lot of projects just for the simple fact that inflation is at nearly 7%, if not at 7%. The cost of labor, the cost of materials. If you call today and you get a pricing on a valve, they'll tell you the valve pricing is good for 24 hours. If you order transformers, we ordered transformers 4 months ago. They're coming back and saying that they're going to need to adjust it because they haven't even been built yet, and they can't make a profit off of the current price. So across the board, I think we're trying to work with the times that we have, and Dawn's done a fantastic job of taking those adjustments that we made in the capital and putting it together in a product that she has mastered and done this plenty of times for us and for all the utilities across the country. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dawn, and then we'll just kind of play off of each other as we progress.
Okay, great.
Welcome, Dawn.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. I do have a PowerPoint presentation I'm going to go through. As Austin said, we presented a plan in July, and with the change in capital, we looked at how that capital would change your operating income, your cash balances, your debt coverage ratios, and what that would translate into the customer as far as possible rate changes. Also new though that we haven't talked about, I'm going to briefly touch on stormwater. We developed a new financial projection for stormwater. We'll talk about that at the very end briefly. So I'm going to just go ahead and share my screen if that works for you guys.
Okay.
And I'm going to start the slideshow here. So again, we're going to go over electric, water, wastewater. One of the things I wanted to emphasize is this is just taking your July projections and changing the capital. We didn't feel, we weren't requested to update the whole projection all over again. So we took that new capital, we put it in. As I said, we are looking at how that would affect your debt coverage ratio, your cash reserves, target operating income, any possible bonding, and we're going to recover that too. We're going to cover that too. Another thing we looked at actually was your PCA formula. You currently have a power cost adjustment, and all a power cost adjustment is there's a certain amount of base power supply costs that are in your base rate schedules, and anything above or below that is automatically passed on to the customer. It's a way to mitigate the financial risk of power supply changes to the utility. About 60% of municipals use it, closer to 80% of investor-owned utilities use this type of mechanism. So you currently have a formula and it is working. However, there were a few questions on where did some of the numbers come from within the formula. We couldn't really identify that. So we might want to clean up that PCA formula. Again, it is working. It's moving things in the right direction, but we might want to clean that up a little bit. And then we'll talk about additional steps too. So let's see here on the next slide. I do not know why this is not moving. Here we go. clear all the drawings here. All right, so basically, this is the electric summary that you saw in July of 2021. And you can see here that capital totaled about $218,000. And with the new capital improvement program, the capital's over in this column here, that totaled about 2.18 million. And we had recommended at the time about every other year rate adjustments of 1.5%, along with that PCA that I talked about, would work for this type of projection. Now, when we look at the new capital, there's such a lag here. When we look at the new capital totals about 4.6 million. That's in this column here. And what changed, just so you know, on the revenue side, we had some revenues rolled in there that at the time of the study, we were told would identify revenues from capital projects. I don't believe that that's coming in the way it was thought it was coming in. So of course we had to adjust our revenues accordingly. And with the upped capital and that slight revenue change in the other revenue column, the rate increase would bump up to about 2.5% per year. And again, we would also recommend kind of cleaning up that PCA formula. And this type of 2.5% translates on a regular residential customer using about 750 kilowatt hours a month to about $2.50 a month. I'm going to review that on towards the very last slides, but I'm just trying to anticipate that question coming. How would this affect our regular residential customer? So let me review PCA real quickly again, and then we'll see if you have any questions on the electric department. But the PCA, power cost adjustment, again, it's a way to mitigate your risks. Many utilities use it. You've got about 68% of your O&M costs are power supply costs, which is completely out of your control. So it mitigates 68% of the financial risk to the utility to have a PCA. Currently, you've got a formula. We might want to clean up just some of that numbers in that formula. And your industrial formula is actually different than your other classes. It's a more complex PCA formula, and it changes. So we're currently analyzing that. We'll probably, by the time we get done analyzing that, we'll make a recommendation if we want it to look more similar to the other classes, or if we think that your industrial PCA is working as is.
Can you just talk about that briefly for some of the people that maybe tuned into this? What the difference is? Just you don't have to get in great detail, but if you can give us an idea.
Yeah. So I believe your current industrial formula is more of a direct. Austin might have to jump in here on this for the exact differences because I haven't completed this portion of it yet here. But your regular PCA formula is more set up more commonly where any pass through or any changes in power supply costs is automatically passed through. We look at power purchased or produced. And we look at the difference in costs, we divide that by units billed, and everybody pays that PCA. That's typically how it is. Your industrial PCA is a little different. Austin, do you have a little bit more information? I haven't completed that analysis yet. Do you know the differences there? I know it's just a little different formula and it changes.
So one of the things that we did, obviously, when we transferred from Darren and myself, is I asked questions, and that's kind of what got us to this point. And there was a lot. So the PPCA and the industrial were all looped into a spreadsheet that was done for eons. And so when we started going through it, there were some questions because there was fixed numbers, and those fixed numbers are numbers that were in there for several years. And we didn't really have an answer for those numbers per se. And that is kind of what led us to this point. And that conversation with Dawn and I, we started that soon after we got back onto this financial projection piece. It's what we talked about doing is having a flat rate industrial rate. So just like we have for commercial and industrial, or commercial and residential, where it's a flat rate across the board, That's what we want to do for industrial because of the fluctuations. I'll also add in here that Dawn took into account our power supply costs have gone up, just like most of everything in this world. So our power supply costs, our wholesale costs have gone up 4.73% as well. So all that's being looped into one kind of financial projection rate analysis.
Yeah, and I just want to add to when Austin maybe uses the words flat rate. I think he maybe, I don't want to talk for you, but a common formula, a common formula for all, not necessarily a flat rate, a common formula that would be applied equally and fairly to all is probably a better way to word that.
Okay. Thank you.
Changing the PCA or making it more formulaic in different ways, does AMI in any way come into play in that aspect, or is that separate and distinct?
So great question. AMI as capital costs would come in your regular rate that comes through as depreciation. You set your rates on a utility basis. Let's just pretend I'm making up numbers. You spend $3 million on AMI. We depreciate that over 15 years. That number would come into your rates through depreciation. So to answer your question directly, the PCA is not affected by AMI costs.
Maybe we should explain AMI. Good.
Following on to Earl's question, I noticed that the rate structure is a flat rate by, it doesn't change by season or by time of day. Yet our rates are greatly affected by the time of day usage and peaking charges. And, you know, my question was going to be on the rate structure is, should we be considering with the implementation of AMI going to a time of day usage rate? Because that would be more fair to the entire populace of the BPW rather than favoring those that are really hitting the congestion charge period the highest.
So currently, you don't have a strong signal for that. However, that could be changing. I'm not really here to talk about exactly that today, or if that is changing. It's being looked at. Okay, I'll word it that way. We're looking at the members to see if that type of pricing signal needs to be stronger to the members, and the members then would optionally change their rate structures to reflect that. If that pricing signal is sent on stronger to the members, you're absolutely correct. It would be beneficial to look at your rate structure, and especially using AMI to have that type of rate structure. In general, I'm not talking tomorrow. I'm talking 5, 10, whatever years from now, when the metering infrastructure is in place for most utilities. In general, electric rates are expected, the structures are expected to change, that all rate classes would have a customer charge. All rate classes would have a demand charge, up to several demand charges. We could have one based on coincident peak, one based on NCP, one possibly based on transmission. And then all rate classes would have a time of use pricing signal that you're talking about. So, so you're correct. The industry is moving in that direction. Do I think in this today, you need to move to that? No, but that discussion needs to be started. And if and when that power supply pricing signal is sent to use more strongly, you might want to pass that on to your customers. Good question.
And I agree with everything you've said, that the market is moving that way. But I think we do get a moderately strong signal now, in as much as, and Austin, correct me, they measure what our peaks are, and that becomes the congestion charge that we get charged year round.
Correct.
So reducing our peaking, we would be reducing our cost of energy throughout the entire year. Now, to your point, Dawn, clearly, the way the industry is going, it's going to be forced more on a daily, hourly basis. But even now, with 1/3 of our rates coming from congestion charge, it would seem like there would be a good cost savings to the ratepayers.
It's prudent to start moving the rates in that direction. Even if you started, let's say, in the next year, in the next rate design, not most likely this rate design, because it takes months to analyze that data, okay? Any AMI data we'd be able to get. It takes months to analyze that data. We have to actually look out how each customer is affected under that rate design. Now, and to order to recommend to you, hey, we think you can move here in 2 years. We think you can move here with 3 years with incremental rate designs, 5 years, 7 years, whatever that may be. Because there's a certain threshold, I'm assuming the board will tolerate on how customers are affected in a changed rate structure. So you're absolutely correct to start talking about that now. We should start analyzing that data, and especially if that signal gets even more strong to you, which could happen in the future, then definitely we want to move in that direction more quickly.
And I agree with that 100%. The only thing is we don't have the infrastructure in place. So I'm not proposing that we change
Right.
from what you have right now. Our hands are tied somewhat in that we don't have, but until we get AMI in and be able to analyze that data, we really can't even consider time of day use rates going.
And in general, we usually like to have a year's worth of data. That doesn't mean there aren't Band-Aids, if you will, or ways we can back into that data in the short term to work you towards using full AMI data and full rate recovery that way. So there are things we can do in the short term. But typically we do like to have a year's worth of data, but you're absolutely right. Thinking along those lines and start talking.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Thanks for the question. Are there any other questions before I move on?
I'm just looking at the sheets. Austin, is AMI in our current expenses? I think it is, right?
It's on the capital budget.
Yeah. Okay. And it's for this year?
What
Yes.
will be this year, 22, 23, I believe.
Yeah.
The other question I had on the electric side is our total cash on hand is going down considerably over the next 3 years. And I'm a little concerned about that for post-storm recovery, cash reserves, and, as always gets preached, cash is king when you're trying to get contractors on board.
Yeah, so that's such a good question or comment, actually. This is what you're talking about here, this cash balance here. And where I don't want to say get nervous, but I see your concern for sure is in this area here, because we want your minimum cash reserve to be about 3.5 million. You can see that you dip down under that minimum in these years and you recover starting to work towards 2026. However, the reason you're recovering there is because let's go look at this this capital improvement program here. You can see that you had an aggressive expenditure in 2023. That's probably the AMI. We could have and could consider bonding for that. All right. But if this capital improvement program holds true and we greatly reduce our spending, you can see that the cash rebounds with small rate adjustments. But you're absolutely correct. That's a decision to think about. Do we want to let our cash dip to that level? And if we do we want to wait for the rebound which will most likely happen if we keep the capital spending where it is. It's a good point to point out. And Austin, can you remind me, do you have a combined cash balance right now? You show that combined, don't you, in your financial statement?
Correct. Kim, you can
Yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay, so
Right.
what also happens is you have a combined cash balance. And what these projections do is try to show you who's drawing down. You actually don't look at it that way. You look at a whole combined cash balance pot, if you will. And what I do when I do these studies is to say, okay, I'm going to look at your net book value and your revenues, and I'm going to start with what I think is a fair cash balance for each utility. All right. Now, in reality, if electric draws down $2.5 million, your cash pot isn't going to look like 1.4 million. It's just going to draw down on that total pot overall, and you're still going to be fine overall. But what you guys are good at doing, obviously, is financially planning. And I try to show you who's drawing down on what. And what this shows is, although in total, when I flick to the next couple slides, you'll see, but it's a little bit skewed because I have bonding on some of the next slides. So it's kind of hard to follow. Your real cash balance that you can lean on is higher than what you're seeing here, if that makes sense. So, but when you see an extraordinary expense like this, an AMI is considered an extraordinary expense. It doesn't happen every day. It's a large investment up front, $2.6 million in 1 year. This is a time you would consider to bond. Does that help answer your question?
Somewhat, but it still leaves me uneasy that our cash is going to be so low, and in that period of time, if we were to get hit by a storm.
Well, here's the second part of this. The AMI most likely, and if there's an engineer on the phone, or Austin, you can jump in, won't be all spent in this 1 year like I have it, most likely. Okay, so your fiscal year, compared to when the AMI really starts being implemented and spent, might not fall exactly within that fiscal year, meaning that capital improvement program could look like 1.2 in 2023. I'm just giving you an example. And 1.3 in 2024, and that cash drawdown would be spread out, which would help this bottleneck here.
Yeah, and there are potential other ways of financing the AMI that we're going to discuss at other meetings. So
Yeah, that's part of where DMEC made their presentation on being able to finance that for us. So
yeah, and if so, what would happen is you'd have the cash influx. Your cash would stabilize and look more like this here, this first slide. But it would draw down slightly because you'd have that debt payment. Of course, that debt payment would be drawing down each year.
yeah, and you're right, because there's 1.7 million for AMI in 22-23, and Austin, is that for bulk buy of all of the meters?
the 1.75 million,
Yeah,
yes, that's how it was presented to us, is that would be full turnkey. Now there's options in there for, like, you know, when you go to, and there's a second part to this, which I'm sure Earl is just, you know, beating at the door to say, but you have the 1.75 million, which includes, and I think that was like the Cadillac of the turnkey operation, which included your outage management system, your transformer readings. It kind of gets into the SCADA side, but then you flip and you have the O&M expense that comes with it that can total 6 figures. So you're hitting it on both sides there.
okay, it's something we have to look at more then. All
Yeah.
right.
Okay, thank you. So is that all the questions on electric before I move on?
There is one question in the queue from Tim Ritzer. Says, is your KWH charge for I think he's saying large generation customers, which I think he's saying industrial. What is it? And none is posted in the tariff. Do you have confidence that the KWH charge is sufficient to recover your actual costs?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We can look that up. And this is one of the pieces that will move on that KWH charge is that PCA that we're talking about, that formula we're trying to clean up a little bit. So that can be more, I don't want to say transparent, more readily guessable, if you will, what that's going to be. So I believe we're working on that, trying to make that kilowatt hour charge a little bit more established. Good question.
Hey, Austin, I know that, we have a new set of eyes looking in at electric, and that's probably very helpful. Do the costs that are being projected in that for projects, does that make, AMI, aside, because we've talked about that, does what we're looking to do make sense to you?
You from a cost perspective or from a timing or both?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I thought. So yes, I think this is a mixture of being both conservative and also ambitious. There's a lot of undergrounding. There's coordination on certain parts of these projects across the board for example, and a lot of people that are on this call probably understand this, is that we have Del Dot doing in the expansion of Kings Highway. And so that road's going to be tore up. So taking advantage of that, if we're putting underground in, if we're replacing water lines, sewer lines, et cetera. So I'm confident in these numbers. It's, you have in here for a bucket truck. And when we did the whole bucket truck thing, you're relying upon where the market stands, 7% inflation this year. Is there going to be 7% again next year? Not quite sure.
And that's a fair question. Is inflation factored in multiple years through this process? No?
Yes.
Yeah.
At what rate by year?
I think I put in here progressively like 2.9 to probably 3.8 and kind of smooth that out. If I would have put a 7% in there consistently, the rates would have had to probably go up higher than what they needed to be, except we don't know. I'm so glad you brought that question up, because that's why it's so important to update these projections like you guys do. Look at it often, because the projections are only good as the data we know today. Now, we're pretty good at forecasting, but we're in a different environment right now. And it makes it more difficult to be able to project those things accurately. So what I'm showing you, basically what you're going to see in these projections is the look at the rates really never stop, right? I'm trying to put in a small incremental program to keep you up to speed with your financial targets. Now, if I overshoot it in one year, all that's going to happen is I can lower the increase in the next year. If I undershoot it in this year and we have to up it next year, we need to have that flexibility to do that. But all I'm trying to do is lessen any rate shock to your customers, smooth out these rate increases so we can plan for them. But we need to be prepared that these things change, and the rate increase in the future might need to be slightly higher or slightly lower.
When you
Good-
look at
good
the inflation across, do you look at it exactly the same for sewer water, for electric? Is it exactly the same math?
I use the same inflation. If you looked at, ENR.com, it probably, you could analyze it by utility. I use the same inflation rate, quite frankly, just to avoid confusion and more complicated questions on why I'm not using the same inflation rate. And all I know about my projection is I'm not going to be exactly on. I'm, hopefully going to be close. That's what I'm trained to do. But we're going to have to make corrections in the following years, one way or the other.
And by the way, if you could actually figure out inflation by year ahead of everybody else, you wouldn't be doing this job.
Right. I wouldn't be working at all.
Your yacht at this point.
Right, exactly. I wouldn't be at all.
If you could
I
just
don't
send me
think,
the-
I think
the
Dawn,
year
what
by
you're
year
proposing is,
inflation, I'd appreciate it.
yeah,
Thank you.
Dawn, I think what you're proposing on inflation is perfect. I mean, yes, it's 7% for the last 2 months, but that is not necessarily indicative of where we're going to be going. And I don't think anybody knows, and anybody who says they do is not being truthful, so.
Yeah, and so we just need to know that we need to be flexible. You know, I gave you the best plan that I know today. But if things change, we might have to tweak that in the future. Good
Understood.
question.
Thank you.
So I'll move to water. This is the financial projection summary you saw in July of 2021. Capital here, these columns over here to the third one to the right, totaled about $8.8 million. We did show bonding of about $9 million. And the rate design at that time, or rate recommendation at that time, was about 6.9%. Now, when we put in the new capital went to 18.8 million with bonding of 18 million. So we had a more aggressive capital plan in water. And if you look at the 3 key targets that I look at, operating income, cash balance, and debt coverage ratio, that's what drives this rate increase. And the rate increase would be projected to go to 18.5% for 3 years, each year for 3 years, and then more inflationary after that. An 18.5% rate adjustment under your current water rates is about a $5 increase per month, additional increase. So $5 per month increase for an 18.5%. And you can see it stabilizes along with the bonding, stabilizes that cash balance, stabilizes your debt coverage ratio. In fact, that debt coverage ratio is at the minimum I want it to be. What I've worked it to help avoid, any rate shock is writing it right at that 1.25. In the perfect world, for financial planning purposes, I would have that closer to the 1.45. The water utility is very susceptible to weather. If I'm in a cold, wet summer and my sales go down, I'm going to be riding that debt coverage ratio right at that minimum. Now, if you're making your debt payment, no one's going to come knocking on your door tomorrow if you don't meet that debt coverage ratio. But if you don't meet your debt coverage ratio and you go to issue bonds in the future, bond rating agencies look back at your past performance. And if you're below the 1.25, which is a typical covenant for a revenue bond, that can be looked upon unfavorably. However, so what I'm showing you here is you could get away with the 18.5, but in these years here, just like we talked about, the 2.9, if I don't see that debt coverage ratio swinging back around where I want it to be, that might be like a 4.9 for the next 2 years after that. But I'm trying to give you a minimum rate track so you know where you need to be.
And just to add to that, so what Dawn recommends is to actually have, obviously you look at your rates all the time, but you also kind of have an expert like Dawn take a look at them every 3 to 5 years. What I will say is when you're looking at this assumes, obviously, there's a lot of discussions on infrastructure money that are out there, ARPA funds through the state, through the feds, some of which, the city received. So you can have some adjustments, if money comes in, but it's not going to really change. And Dawn, you may want to speak to that part of it.
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Yeah, go ahead, because I don't want to steer your thunder.
No, thank you for bringing that up. So, and I don't want to say anything that's uncomfortable, because ARPA funds and IIJ funds are 2 different things. Okay, so ARPA funds are automatic. The cities, towns, villages received ARPA funds. Those funds, without applying for them, those funds went directly to the city administrators to decide how to disperse those funds. Those funds are supposed to fall under 4 statutory requirements. The first one is wording COVID-19, whatever, there's some special wording there. For the what does that mean for electric, water, and wastewater utilities? That some utilities are, the delinquencies in the utilities are falling under that we're using ARPA funds to make up for the delinquencies. The next 2 categories don't really apply to water and wastewater or electric. The 4th category directly applies to water and wastewater and telecommunications infrastructure. You can use ARPA funds for water, wastewater, and broadband infrastructure. So ARPA funds could be used to bring this down, but the difference is you've got to make your voice be known to the city officials. There's going to be a lot of people pulling them in different directions to get those funds. All right, they're automatic, they're coming. If they're not already here for you, you got to let your voice be known that you've got projects for that.
And then also, obviously, the state received a large sum of money, is 925, I believe, million. And so that is in the process of being allocated. Some part of it is allocated. And so that is another avenue to go down. But again, we sit on every WEAC meeting, Charlie, myself, waiting for that allocation to come out of that 925 million so that it kind of gives us a path forward.
Yeah, and then the IIJ funds, there's about $55 billion allocated for, of which I think about 15 million is allocated for lead line replacement, 10 million is allocated for PFAS or chemical cleanup, and the rest is just kind of rolled into that package. So, but IIJ, whoops, that's my headset here. Sorry about that. I talk with my hands and flung out my headset. But the IIJ, we're kind of waiting to hear what's happening with that and how those funds are going to come down. It sounds like we'll most likely have to apply for those funds. They're not automatic. The notice of funding opportunity is expected to come within the next month or 2. You can go to grants.gov to see when that's available, when those funds are available to apply. And the notice of funding opportunity will tell you who's eligible, what projects are eligible, deadlines, those sorts of things. So although there's money floating around out there, the only guaranteed funds are the ARPA funds. So keep that in mind. But thanks for bringing that up, Austin. Mm-hmm. But if we did get funding, of course, it would help cushion and soften the bond issues needed. Most likely, you wouldn't get funding for all the projects that you need here. So it would most likely just soften the bonding needed. Does that answer any questions on that?
And I would say
it raises a question. So when it comes to filing for the grants, and I went on the site just as you were talking about it, and there was tips for how to write it, et cetera, et cetera. Are there people like you with rate cases that are also helpful for us to tie into that might be able to write this up for us in a way that advantages us in some situations?
Yep. So there are grant writers. If you go there, you said you just pulled up that website. Another website you can pull up is SAM. And what that is it's, I forget what the name is for that acronym, but anyway, it's, you should register in SAM. And what that helps you do is see where your grants are. You have to register in there to qualify. So there's 2 things you can do to get started right now. Is 1, make sure you have a DUNS number. A DUNS number is just a 9-digit unique number for each entity. When you go into SAM, the first thing they're going to say is, what's your DUNS number? If you don't have a DUNS number, you click on, I don't have a DUNS number, and it brings you to Dun & Bradstreet's website to get a DUNS number. And so then you want to register in SAM. Anybody that's looking for a federal grant needs to be registered in SAM. Now, beyond that, those 2 websites that I told you, I'm going to be quite honest. They're very overwhelming when you first open them. They're supposed to be more streamlined and user-friendly, but as you've indicated, there's little videos, how do you write a grant? And if you just click around for a little bit, you do learn quite a bit, but it's literally one click at a time. Even, I go in there and I have to click and watch some videos to get to the next step or whatever. So there are grant writers. I don't do that. Those websites, you actually can learn a lot, but honestly, you got to take some time and click around in there. But those are the things you can do to start getting prepped. But that's, the IIJ is, in my opinion, and nobody knows what that's going to look like yet for sure, certainly more complicated than the ARPA funds to get.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor, I think you have a question. Go ahead.
You're muted, Mayor.
Right, got it. I didn't have a question, but I attended a presentation by Secretary Geissenberg, and in the governor's budget, he has indicated what his desires are or what his thoughts are on how the ARPA monies will be allocated across the large spectrum. I will try to pull that presentation up. It was supposed to be posted. When I checked yesterday, it had not yet been posted, and I'll share it with you. But obviously, the governor's budget is an indication, but it's got to go to the legislature for final approval. So they haven't done it yet. And we probably won't have answers on all of that until June. So just, it's out there, but, and it's very generous, but I'll try to get the information from that presentation so you can all take a look at it.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
So good. I will move to wastewater real quickly. You're looking at the same charts for each of these. In July, capital totaled 3.6 million. The recommended rate adjustments were about 2.9 at that time. With the new capital improvement funding, spending of 15.8 million and bonding of 15 million, that rate increase would move to about 7.9%, which equates to about $7 for the average residential customer.
When you talk about bonding, and it can be different things, but what rate do you apply to that? What interest rate?
So I believe I have these at 20 years at 3.5%.
Okay,
Good question.
unfortunately. Thanks.
So, okay.
What was the increase, the dollar increase?
About $7 for wastewater.
Thank you.
Yep. So before I move on to from electric, water, wastewater and into stormwater, which we have never talked about yet, actually, do you guys have any questions?
Austin, if you look at the capital improvements, are there ones that we should dig into further from your perspective? And unfortunately, that can be more expensive or less expensive depending upon how it turns out.
So a lot of it, so obviously we're moving forward with the wastewater treatment plant and the major lift stations. We're having a condition assessment done by GHD, and I think that will shed some light. And I'm talking in sewer now, and then I'll kind of round everything out. But through that condition assessment, I think that's going to give us a framework moving forward. I think we will work with the current provider down there, so Inframark, to really get a grasp on capital as we get that condition assessment back. GHD has given us so far very, very quality work. It's very detailed. It gives great recommendations moving forward. I think there's opportunities where you could adjust some or push some somewhere and push some either farther or sooner. Obviously, when you do this, you're looking at really 1 year, and your hope is that the following year nothing breaks, nothing changes, and that's a perfect world, and we all know that doesn't exist. And so there's probably opportunities that we can push and make some adjustments. I'm confident in this. It's a tough answer.
I understand.
I think when we put this most recent budget together, we intentionally made it pretty aggressive in hopes that money would be coming available from the federal government. I think we try to put things in there we really would like to have, and maybe we wouldn't have put there if we didn't anticipate some money. I'm not saying we overdid it, but I think we were on the aggressive side. So hopefully there's things in there we could, shave back a little bit if we had to.
And I think that's safe. I think that's safe to say. Obviously, another factor in this whole thing is that when you're talking about work on infrastructure within Del Dot right of ways, right? You only get 7 months out of the year. So when you look at some of these larger scale projects, I'll throw Cedar out there. We're doing the water study, and that's the pipe assessment, just to see where certain assets fall on the criticality scale for replacement. And so you also want to kind of tag team that with what's coming forward as far as, if a Del Dot project where they're going to tear up the road, it obviously makes sense to take advantage of that. If you have pipes that need to be replaced at that time, you do it because there's going to be a moratorium on that road. But also know that you can't, in theory, in a town this small, you can't have 2 construction projects going on state roads. And so when you can only operate on a 7-month essentially working period, it kind of hinders your ability to move a 5-year capital project along because you're losing 40%, 30-40% of your time to be able to work. So it's tough.
Austin, do these numbers have in the emergency funding that we put in place in the last meeting?
Yes.
So those are in these numbers.
Hold on, let me just take a look. Yes. So for example, in this year, we did the emergency funding of 1.75 million, which that loan is in the process of, it has to go before the city, get approved, and then that comes back to us.
But that's in the math for these line items or not?
Correct. It is.
Okay. When we look at these projected expenses, do they include pervious pavement where it's needed? And does it include uplift for prevailing wages as well?
So it's a great question. If you're funding from the state, it's prevailing wages. So anything we get from the state, it's a prevailing wage job. So wastewater treatment plant project, that will be a prevailing wage job.
It's just because I'm dumb. If I look at the 2024, well, pick a number. I look at one of these projected year expenses. Does that include the prevailing wage in these numbers?
Yeah. So I worked with Charlie, and when Charlie gave me the numbers for the project, you add in the prevailing wages into that.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yep.
I think wastewater
Tim has a question.
Wastewater seems to be, as opposed to the electrical, I'm much more comfortable with the cash reserve that we have. In the capital projects that we've got going on, we're maintaining an adequate cash reserve for any of the unforeseens that we might have. And, the wastewater system, unless it's a major storm, is less at risk than the electrical system. So it just amplifies the concerns over the cash reserve on the electrical side, but makes me feel good on the wastewater and the water side.
Yeah, so good question, good comment and observation too. But recall that we're borrowing in water and wastewater, and we're not in electric. So in addition, we don't look at it, we have a combined cash balance. So really, when we add all these numbers up by year, let's say that example, that 2023 year, all other things being equal, you've got that cash pot to lean on. I separate them out just so you can see exactly what you're commenting on, which brings you to the answer of, do you borrow for AMI or don't you? In my mind, that's the bottom line, what you're trying to say, because what's drawing down the electric funds in part is that extraordinary AMI expense that you're trying to fund from cash from operations. So if you're going out to bond for water and wastewater, you know, maybe you do a bigger bond, and of course you split that bond out by utility, and borrow 1.5 million or whatever it is for AMI, to keep that electric cash balance, stable.
Good point. Very good point, Dawn. And
Yeah,
there's.
good question.
Austin, Tim has a question.
DMAC.
Yeah, so Tim put a question in the Q&A. Is the wastewater forecast increase across the board the same regardless of type of customer? So for example, residential, commercial, and industrial.
Yeah, so super good question. I'm gonna flip a couple slides, okay? And show you. This is wastewater right here. And you've got a great question. You charge a customer charge by meter size. It's a progressive charge by meter size. That is an appropriate rate structure, meaning the larger meter costs more, because the larger meter does cost more. The infrastructure to service a larger meter costs more. You know, the distribution system going up to that and so forth. So the point being, you know, the larger meter also has more draw potential on the plant and so forth. So you charge, I'm only showing you a 5/8 inch meter here example, all right? But you would have a 3/4 inch, 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inch, 6 inch, so forth meter charge that progressively gets larger. And then you charge a commodity rate of $5.72 per 1,000 gallons used. So when you say across the board, you can see in this 5/8 inch meter example, I don't just take the rate increase and apply it on both sides equally. I try to drive that customer charge up using an old cost of service study, and try to, you know, balance that from the customer charge and the commodity rate. And then I look at usage, and how I'm affecting each customer by usage. I'm trying to be as fair as possible. You will never, when you have a fixed and variable charge, unless you do an across the board rate increase, this percentage will never be the same for each user, all right? That's what I have to look at to balance it. That's the art part of all this. So to answer your question, each residential, commercial, and industrial, on average, I'm shooting for a 7.9% rate increase in this rate class for wastewater, residential, commercial, industrial. However, I balance that between the fixed charge and the customer charge. So if I were to finish this page here and laid out from a 5/8 inch meter all the way to a 10 inch meter, I have to design the rate so each meter looks similar to this, meaning maybe the top sees an 8% and the low sees a 6.63. So it's not a straight across the board. I have to deal with different customer charges by meter size. And since you do that, you naturally send the right pricing signal between the meter sizes. Good question.
One thing we're not doing right now, and the new brewery brings it to a head, I think, is that we're not charging for load or strength of the waste.
Oh, you're not charging surcharges, BOD, COD?
So that's one thing I think we have to look at very carefully going forward.
Yeah, so if you don't have surcharges in place, yeah, that's something you might want to look at.
Yeah.
But what happens is if you know, and I can get into this with Austin off this call, but we'll see what costs you have associated that if you have an IIP department or not, whatever, and take a look at that. That's a good point.
Hey, Dawn, a question. If we look at the different levers that we have, right? There's electric, there's wastewater, there's water, et cetera. How often the Board of Public Works actually manage each one individually versus looking at different methods of pooling and spreading the peanut butter, so to speak?
Yeah, so 1000%, I'm going to answer it that they are separate enterprise funds. Electric is a separate enterprise fund from water, from wastewater, and that's exactly what you want to avoid is combining funds and having some funds subsidize the other. So
Well,
you guys are set.
Stormwater comes to mind because it's hard to decide what that cost is, and I know we'll talk about that later. That's really why I was asking the question.
Yeah, good question. Let's go up to stormwater because we were kind of ready to talk about that. I think we've exhausted all the questions on the other stuff here. And we're going to, and we can get into more discussion on stormwater. All I'm showing you right now is the financials. I'm not showing you any rate structure right now. But this is the first time we've looked at your stormwater. And the stormwater utility is currently operating at losses. Obviously, if we did nothing, this is showing you nothing, doing nothing, you're going to continue to operate at losses. Your cash balance will go negative. In fact, it would already go negative because we've got some capital improvement here. And you can see I have bonding here. Okay. Now I'm only looking at the financial picture right now, and then we can get in, if you guys want, into a stormwater discussion. But the next slide would show, all I'm trying to show you is that if we wanted to stabilize the losses in the stormwater system, with the capital improvements we have planned, we would need a 1.2 basically million bond and have rate adjustments of 15%. Now, if you want to get into any discussion beyond that in stormwater, we can do that. Or we can be done with that discussion, whatever you guys want.
Well, I guess part of the discussion I'd like to have us have is the issuing a bond to cover the improvements versus changing the rates to cover what we're already view as kind of a loss projections.
Yeah, so good question. For the amount of capital you have, I wouldn't recommend driving the rate increases higher to cover that bond. A, the increases would be so astronomical, it wouldn't be prudent. B, I don't even know if it would cover it all. But let me answer it also this way. We still want to have rate defendability, okay? And when we look at this column here, operating income, this exact middle column, I determine what that operating income should be. In the perfect world, if we funded everything perfectly, every single year, that operating income right here, this line would be about $100,000. You can see that the first year I still have a loss. The second year I'm only at 10,000, third year at 34,000 and so forth. I only get to the $100,000 in the fifth year. That means for these full 5 years, I'm not fully funding this program. But I'm doing that because I'm trying to balance the rate shock here. I'm trying to say, okay, we took a long time to get into this hole. I'm not going to get out of it tomorrow. How can I get out of it over time and avoid as much rate shock as I can to my customers and slowly work me towards my targets? Now you can see this is a minimum. I just barely get you to the operating income. My minimum cash balance, I'm at about 120,000. I really want you to be more like 150,000. Okay. But I've bonded for 3 years of capital improvements, which is typically the max I can bond for. I could have slipped another little borrowing in here at $150,000, but I thought that would kind of confuse the projection here. So my point being, you're not, for the capital improvement program we have, you're not going to be able to sustainably have a rate adjustment that's going to cover it. And besides that, it would drive us so far past our operating income, it starts to become questions of rate defendability. But good comment, good question.
And I fully understand. I mean, raising rates to cover the 1.1 or $1.2 million is untenable, but we are only charging $5 for wastewater now, for stormwater.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that our expenses are greater than that. Would increasing the rates to get to a more defendable position and bonding be a better mix?
That's up to you, what you feel your threshold is for a rate increase in the stormwater area. Absolutely, you can get here a million ways. I can, in this 2023, I can put in, this is about a 45% rate increase. I could put in 50% right there. In the first year, go for it, 50% rate increase, and maybe 5% after that or something. I'm just, to smooth, to get you where you need to be. We could put in 25 and 25 and then go to 2.9s, whatever it is. But I'm just trying to show you a smoothed out rate increase at a minimum to show you how to get there. But you're right, you could go as high as you want. It's your discretion.
I mean, there's a lot of public sentiment on wastewater fee, stormwater fees. And, I think we need to look deeper into, rather than charging maybe $5 per meter, doing it by lot frontage or some other way that more directly reflects the usage. But I think this is an area where we as a board have to really look at the utility.
So
Well, I think on our MOU with the city, we have that as an item that we have to work on. See the mayor shaking his head there.
So you're absolutely, let me give you some background on stormwater. Okay. I didn't know if we were going to go there, but you just went there. So let's go there real quick. Stormwater is controversial. All right. In Michigan, where I am, there are several lawsuits for stormwater. Let's just back all the way up and start from the beginning. Stormwater, of course, is a needed service. All right. It takes care of snow melt, rain, whatever it is, to help mitigate flooding, and so to speak. So historically, that has historically been, we put the pipes in the ground 50, 60 years ago. The city did it. Now we're finding, okay, that old infrastructure really isn't good enough for what we need today. We have changing EPA standards. We have new technologies. It's getting much more expensive. Look at your capital plan. I mean, it's getting much more expensive to run a system like this. So here's where the controversy starts though. Do we view stormwater like a tax where the city manages and handles, and I'm going to finish and talk all the way through here. I'm going to talk both sides, so don't get nervous, but where the city handles the stormwater utility and like many have typically done in the past, the city manages that. Well, the people on the other side say, well, that's not really fair to assess a stormwater charge based on your tax, because that would be on your assessed value. And what does assessed value really have to do with impervious surfaces, right? And generally there's not a good tie there. So the people on the other side are saying, look, this infrastructure is getting more complicated, more sophisticated, more expensive. We need to have a user fee. And when we do that, what's typically done is, and again, I'm not recommending this because it's too controversial for me to say, this is where you get an attorney involved. It's too controversial for me to say you should be using it as a tax, you're charging it as a tax and have the city handle this, or you should be charging a fee. So I want to make that clear. I'm not recommending either way. I'm just telling you the ways we see it done. So what typically happens is we assess stormwater where we take the average a residential customer and we look at the impervious surface there and we define what that is. And then that's called a residential equivalent unit. And we look at, for example, a commercial, then we look at commercial, industrial. We can go out and do field studies and take measurements and figure all that out. Or we can use aerial imagery and computer software to help us determine what what the total impervious surfaces are, what's the total our equivalent REU units we should have. So for example, I have a REU, one REU, which is one residential customer. Let's just pretend I have a small commercial customer. And I determine that that surface is a 3-to-1 ratio, meaning the residential customer should pay a 1 REU and that commercial customer should pay a 3 REU. So what the utility then does is count how many REUs total they have in the system, equivalent REUs in the system. And then they take their total stormwater expenses, and you just divide that out and you say, okay, everybody should pay, and I'm only throwing out an example, $15 per REU. So a residential customer would pay 15, and the commercial customer that might have a 3 REU would pay $45. And the industrial customer that has a 10, would pay $150 and so forth. Now, that's what can happen is there's something called, especially in Michigan, that's why there's so many challenges in Michigan. It's called the Bolt test. It's the Headley Amendment, and there's a Bolt test in there, and there's some statutory requirements under that. 1, the fee has to be reasonable. It has to be for regulatory purposes 2, and 3 is it has to be voluntary. So what's happening is the question becomes, is a stormwater fee voluntary? Can the customer really control when it snows, rains, whatever? Unlike when they walk over to their water faucet, they turn on their faucet and they use 6,000 gallons a month. That's voluntary. They go over to the faucet, they turn it on. Stormwater fees are not voluntary. I can't control the rain or the snow or whatever. And so that's where the controversy comes in. Is this really a voluntary fee in the customer's control that they're using a service? Or is a stormwater system for the greater good of the community and the city should handle it? That's not a question I'm here to answer. I'm just telling you those are the questions you face in determining the proper rate structure for a stormwater system. Does that help?
I think it does. And one of the comments that was brought up by Tim Richard was, it's not a question, but a statement. The rate for stormwater should reflect the demand the property at the property address, which the property address is places on the system, not based on the presence of a meter. Stormwater is a non-metered service.
Yeah, and currently, so that's absolutely one view of this. You should pay based on your impervious surface, on the demand, on what you're contributing to the runoff, right? That's one view. The other view is you don't have any control of that. But to back up even what Tim's saying, your current rate is not based on a metered service. You actually charge like $5 for a residential fee, $10 for commercial, and I think it's 15 for industrial. Is it 20? Okay, 20 for industrial. The point being, it is not, your current fee isn't based on a meter service, in a meter. It's based on a flat fee. So the question becomes, okay, you've already established that's how you're charging your customers. Now, in the short term, we're losing money. You're not operating at a positive. Your stormwater is drawing down. Remember that cash pot I talked about? Drawing down on the other utilities cash, right? We got to fix that. That's what the 15% does. Now beyond that, so tomorrow, today, whenever you guys decide, we could say, all right, we're going to put a 15% rate increase on that $5, $10, and that $20. We're going to get this program rolling. Now, beyond that, you guys need to decide, how do we really view our stormwater? Do we view it as a greater good? Do we view it as people are actually contributing because of the driveways and the roofs and the whatever they have? And if they are, is it a voluntary service?
I think Tim's question is mainly, or statement is mainly, because it's the way that the stormwater is applied now. It's tied to having a water meter at the property.
But it's not based on the meter's usage, is what he's, yeah,
Correct.
It's just tied to having a meter, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah.
And Don, so for your information, I'm not sure where, a lot of the pushback we get is there are parts of this town that we don't actually have stormwater system in place. For example, out on the beach, because it's low lying, you can't drain it to open sources. And so some of the pushback we get is, well, why should they be paying for stormwater? And, the opposing view is, well, the rest of the town needs to be drained so that you can drive through it and you can get to Second Street and other places. And thereby, like you were saying, it's kind of like a city. We're maintaining the stormwater system for the viability of the entire town.
Exactly.
And that's the conundrum that we have here.
And that's why it's so controversial.
Somebody has speaking going on in the background. If they could turn their microphone off. I'm not sure who the.
Yeah.
Sounds like it might be the mayor. Okay. All right. Okay. Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Dawn. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So anyway, that's just a discussion. So my job is for today is to say, the utility is as is not covering its expenses. How do we fix that? Now, beyond all that, I feel for you in your discussions, because I honestly, even as a rate consultant, can see both sides of that. I can see it being a city service, and I can see it being a user fee, where those that are contributing to that, but then I see where that's not voluntary. So beyond that discussion, we'll go from there. I mean, we'll leave it at what I'm proposing is a 15% rate increase, and then beyond that, it sounds like you guys have some discussions to do. So
if you look at the capital improvements that we've got in there, I assume none of that would be something that if we have status changed to a higher level, an MS level, MS4 or whatever. Are these just current numbers?
Austin, these are just current numbers on what you feel needs to be done there, right? Is that what your question is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just muted.
I'm curious if this takes into consideration any, requirements that we have above and beyond what we have today.
It has, so basically, yeah, MS4 is in there. Again, MS4 is similar to like trying to play the lottery, because it's just the luck of the draw. And so we don't really know. And there's a ton of questions out there. Obviously, it makes sense for the BPW to be labeled as the MS4 permittee, but just for clarity, the city handles the streets, and so they get the water to our infrastructure. So the opportunity for either one of us to get labeled as an MS4 permittee is up in the air. A lot was discussed on whether or not it was going to come with the census. We still have not heard anything. Our neighboring towns on the western part of the county have already been designated. Their programs have been started, 2 years already. And one of the things that they said was, really don't do anything ahead of the game, because you don't know what's going to be requested of you when that time comes. So, those numbers are in there as placeholders, and we continue to move them as time progresses, knowing that at some point in time, it's going to come down on us.
Okay, thank you.
But it's in
Reinforce
there.
Austin's statement. There's $600,000 for MS4, and that really is a dart at the wall, because what's going to be required of us and when, totally unknown at this point. Now, Austin, I don't know if you heard it, but the last I heard, in the discussions I had, was it looked like this was at least 2 years out for being designated as an MS4 region.
To be honest, we kind of thought that it was going to be the 2020, 2021. And I don't know how much the pandemic played on that, just from the back end part, because it's coming down from the EPA. I think we've sat here and said it was going to be, you know, a year and then 2 years and then so forth. I still assume that it's going to come within the next year or two. And I remain pretty confident of that.
Yeah, because the rules have to do with census and population, but then also it's where you draw the boundaries around. And that's where the uncertainty comes in, because none of the towns individually down here meet the threshold. But if they start combining the eastern towns, then you do get over the threshold. And
Correct.
that's discussions I had on it.
And I'd rather be in a position where we get some money now, knowing it's like sending a kid to college, you know, it's going to happen, hopefully. And having some money, you know, to cover these costs, I think is the right way to look at it proactively.
Right,
Mayor?
and just on the discussion, the first phase of MS4 is to do GIS and studies. And we're very far along on having that data. So the implementation phase of what's going to be required comes after that.
Correct.
So we're probably front end loaded right now, but the back end is still uncertain.
And that's where you get your studies done, and you know, throwing an example out there that a lot of people use is that, you know, if you have a farm, a dog park, and you have runoff, usually there's high nitrate levels. And so a lot of it is treating it at the source. Like Tom said, we do have a lot of data currently. We continue to expand that data so that we're, you know, prepared for when that day comes. Mayor, did you have something?
Just to add to that, I think one of the things you would have to also consider is the amount of impervious surface coverage, and whether or not there's a rate adjustment according to how much impervious surface coverage is on the property.
So it's flip side, pervious and impervious.
Exactly. Yeah, both sides of it.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's something we actually don't have data on. So
Yeah, I know that.
And that's a regulatory nightmare, because every time somebody paves their driveway or puts a shed out back or
Yeah,
basically anything, you've got to pick it up and change your rate.
right. But that can be addressed with coordinating building permit issuance and recognizing the change in impervious surface.
Wait, do you need a building permit to pave your driveway?
You don't have to have a building permit to pave your driveway if you're replacing it, but if you're putting in a new driveway, you do.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, to be continued, I'm sure.
Yeah. Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Dawn?
Hey, great. So next steps, or let me just kind of wrap this up, I guess. We would propose rate adjustments, or the, you know, reviewing of rate adjustments for 2023, revising that PCA document, just tightening up that formula a little bit. And then of course, I already kind of went over how each of these rate designs would affect the average use customer. Electric's about $2.50 a month. Water is about $5 a month. And wastewater is about $7 a month.
Can you go back a couple
pages?
pages?
Sure. Tell me when.
One more, this one. So
This one?
yeah, that one. I was looking at Rehoboth, and it was actually in like 2019, I think, that I was looking at. And they did have a different rate for kind of in season and out of season. Is that something that's popular in other locations? I'm not pitching.
This is for water. This is for water too, just to add clarity. That
Yeah.
question.
Oh, you're asking, okay, for water for that question. Okay, yep. So,
Again, I'm
Okay.
not proposing it. I'm just trying to understand what other people.
yeah, no, it's a great question, because I want to talk a little bit about your rate structures. So in general, we've talked about how the electric utility in general is moving to time of use rate, which would be automatically, you know, taken into account seasonal. So yes, the electric industry is moving that way. All right. Now let's flip to water real quick. And let me show you something about your rate structure. So you do not have seasonality, but what you do have is you have an inclining block rate structure, which means the more you use, the more you pay. And what this rate structure tends to favor is one, the low use customer, which some people equate to low income customer, but that's not always true. But what it does is send an energy conservation pricing signal, or excuse me, water conservation pricing signal. The more you use, the more you're going to pay. So people try to conserve. Okay.
Yep.
The downside to this type of rate design is you're charging most likely, in proportionately, your larger industrial customers, because they're almost automatically, I'm talking a 4-inch, 6-inch, 8-inch meter, they're almost always going to fall over this 9,000 usage. Okay, so a lot of the cost burden is bared to the large user. Now, how do we correct that? Sometimes you'll see a rate like this for residential. I'm not even recommending this either. It's complicating rates, but I'm just answering your question. How do I see different rate structures for seasonality or for whatever? Now, in a way, in a tiny, tiny way, you've got some seasonality built in your water rate because, of course, most likely the customers that sprinkle, they're going to fall into this higher category. Okay, so this is a good pricing signal to hit the sprinkling people, to send a more soft pricing signal to a low user. But it's not a positive rate design for your commercial and industrial customers, because they fall in that larger rate block. So I don't commonly, this rate structure I see, of course, across the country, but the most common I see is a customer charge by meter size and then one commodity rate. But of course, these rates became more popular during energy conservation and water conservation push, where the more you use, the more you pay. But again, if we don't break this out and charge a separate commercial rate, industrial rate, we could be harming our industrial customers. Typically, and every industrial customer is different. Typically, an industrial customer will have a more stable, even load throughout the year. Now, I'm not talking about like Heinz pickling or something where, they pickle in the summer and it really spikes and all that stuff. I'm talking about a typical industrial user will be more stable throughout the year.
Dawn, one thing we haven't talked about is you mentioned sprinkling. We have a separate rate for that. And
Yeah.
it's relatively high compared to the domestic rate.
So it falls into that 272 category.
Yep.
Yeah, it's all charged the 272.
Yep.
So
But
good
no-
question.
But no wastewater fee.
Correct.
Yeah, no wastewater.
Yeah.
The one thing that we haven't touched on, and it's another major hot button, it's really a matter of education, is the readiness to serve, the monthly charge. And the first question I have is, how much of our fixed cost are we covering with our readiness to serve charges in the 3 utilities?
Okay, good question. I'm not going to answer about it. How much are you covering? I'm going to answer it because unless you're perfectly at cost to serve, I don't know how much you're recovering, right? Unless your rates are perfectly at cost to serve, where I have looked at the study and I know how much is being recouped in there, I can't really answer that. In general, what's in that customer charge though are things like administrative costs that don't change with usage. Billing, meter reading, customer service. I mean, are you going to fire a customer service rep because somebody didn't use water that month? No, that's a fixed cost to you. You send a bill even if there's 0 usage. So billing falls into that. accounts payable, accounts receivable. Now, typically a portion of the distribution infrastructure falls into that customer charge too. And what do I mean by that? In a cost of service study, in general, we look at it by saying, all right, just because a customer is connected and has the ability to have service, there's a certain amount of infrastructure we would need that customer to have. That's called a minimum system analysis, where we look at the minimum system we would need just because customers are connected. Well, customers use commodity. They use electric, water, wastewater, or, dispersed wastewater. And so we build larger than the minimum, and that's the portion that's rolled into the commodity usage. And so when we look at that, typically about 20 to possibly up to 50% of the distribution infrastructure is rolled into that customer charge too. So it's a very detailed analysis. It's not just, we threw a dart on the wall. We didn't do a cost of service study this time. I need to be clear on that. But that is how a cost of service study is done, where we analyze the administrative costs and a portion of the distribution infrastructure that should roll into there.
And that was exactly what I was trying to get to, is that, as time moves on, we're getting more and more renewable energy customers, and they may have a net,
Zero.
a net of zero usage, but still be connected, because when the sun don't shine, they need to use electricity. But when the sun is shining, they're sending power back into the distribution system. And that seems to me to be inequitable to renters, lower income people whose houses are not situated where they can put solar on. And thereby, those people are taking the burden of keeping up a larger portion of the infrastructure. I know this has been discussed a lot in the industry.
So it's a little bit more complicated. So let me just word it by this way. The reason that the industry is moving to different rate structures is to accommodate distributed energy resources. What happens is when a residential customer puts on solar panels on their house, they may use less kilowatt hours, but their demand doesn't go down. Just exactly what you said. They're still tied to the infrastructure. When a cloud cover goes over, they get back on the system. So what the industry is moving to is we need to, as a first Band-Aid, get that customer charge to where it needs to be. But most importantly, moving where we're changing these rate structures, where we're charging a demand rate cost recovery for this is just a simplified example, power supply cost recovery, transmission cost recovery, and distribution infrastructure cost recovery. And then the kilowatt hour usage would be all on time of use. And if we have that proper rate structure set up, then there isn't a bad customer, quote unquote, bad customer on the system. So right now, what's happening with net metering, the distribution infrastructure portion that's being rolled into the kilowatt hour charge is what the utility is losing. So everybody's subsidizing that. And so the best way to handle the changing industry is to evolve our rates to handle that.
And the one other thing I would add is that besides distributed energy, and you're absolutely correct on, I agree with that 100%, is we also have a seasonality component, which is houses which are unoccupied during the majority of the winter, but they, people still come down on a weekend and are drawing from our distribution system, yet their usage is greatly diminished, but our upkeep is still, it's 24/7. So
Absolutely. That's another.
So we have two parts. We have the distributed energy and we have seasonality, which is a very large part of our customer base.
You absolutely nailed it, right? So if you have distribution cost recovery, or if your customer charge isn't set properly, let's start there. If your customer charge isn't set properly and you have a seasonal customer, your year-round ratepayers are subsidizing that seasonal customer. It's another reason, forget about distributed energy resources. That's just a reason alone to have your customer charges where they should be. Because we've rolled, if you have your customer charge, it's too low, and you roll cost recovery in the variable component, and you have seasonal customers, just like you said, you're not going to get that cost recovery. They're paying a low customer charge, and the rest of the system is subsidizing that seasonal customer. You're exactly right.
And we need to do a lot more public education, because a lot of people view the readiness to serve charge as a penalty, but they, trying to get across that it's really a way of equalizing the rates across the transient population and a permanent population, and the permanent population is cross-subsidizing the other side.
And that's,
Right, if it's not set properly, yep.
and I was going to say, I mean, it's every municipality is different. And I'll just use the example as Rehoboth. Rehoboth, their ready to serve charge of their fixed cost is very low, while their commodity rate is 2, 3, 4 times as higher than what ours is. So while we're charging $6 per 1,000 gallons in sewer as an estimate, they're charging $14. So there you get into that rhythm where, and kind of what Dawn said, is that in the winter, those that are full-time are now paying a commodity rate that's $14 instead of how ours is, where their commodity rate is much lower while their fixed costs are the same.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else, Dawn?
I believe that I've covered everything that I needed to cover.
Very nice. Very nice.
So there is 2
Yeah.
questions. Roberts was first, and it says at the conclusion of Miss Lund's presentation, I have a question for her and the board.
Okay.
So Josh, do you want to promote Robert Kennedy so he
Yes.
can speak?
I'm doing that now.
And then there's going to be a second question after that from Tim.
Okay. Robert, you should be able to talk.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Robert.
Hi, Dawn. Good afternoon. For the record, my name's Robert Kennedy, 123 Henlopen Shores Circle, otherwise known in some circles as Don Quixote for continuing to tilt at the utility rate design windmills. I'm not questioning Dawn's quantification of the revenue requirement or the allocation of costs to various customer classes, because I know, as she said, she hasn't done a cost of service study. But I would like to hear what rate design she recommends to the board to implement going forward. Specifically, is she now recommending that customers be charged the same rate for similar utility service regardless where they are within the BPW service area? Is she recommended doing away with the in-city versus out-of-city rate differential? And if not, what's the basis for continuing rate discrimination?
Yeah, so great question, Robert. Did you want me to start answering that first, or did the board want to jump in?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I totally hear you. So let me explain it by saying it this way. Right now, you do have a rate differential between inside city and outside city. It's about a 1.45, just round it to say 1.5. There is complete justification to do that for industry standards, but it's totally up to the board whether you do that or not. So let me just back up of why it's considered acceptable practice. If you do a cost of service study, there's a component called a rate of return. The rate of return for an outside city customer is justifiably to be higher. Typically, it's associated with risk. Now, I know Delaware has kind of different rules and regulations where you don't have a lot of competition out there, but let's talk about lot sizes. Typically, lot sizes outside the city are larger. And so it takes more distribution infrastructure. There's more replacement, when that needs to be replaced and so forth. So it's totally up to the board whether you decide to do a multiplier for inside the city or outside of the city. That's under your control. But the industry recognizes there are reasons to do that. The problem becomes when it's not justified as far as, okay, in Michigan, for example, I just talked to a utility yesterday, they charge 2 times the multiplier. And I said, okay, there's justification to have an incremental multiplier, but 2 is not the right answer. In general, when we do a cost of service study, it falls between about a 1.3 and a 1.6. So you at a 1.45 is definitely not alarming. Am I saying it needs to be? Am I saying you should maintain it? That's completely under the board's discretion in order to do that. I'm telling you, there's justification to be able to do that. Now, my rate design, I didn't do a cost of service study. So my rate design follows that 1.5 multiplier, but certainly, I'm open to discussion on that. So meaning, Robert, to directly answer your question, that's up to the board and council, how they want to handle that. There's absolute justification for what they're doing. Now, if that's a political hot button and they want to either back that down or reconsider, that's up to them.
If I'm still audible, thank you very much. Dawn, you're familiar with the utility rate principle of cost averaging within customer classes, are you not?
In general, it depends what you mean, but in general.
Well, it's been my experience that many rate designs for, let's just use the residential because that's the one most people can relate to. Basically, utilities average the cost to serve all of the customers within their service area and come up with a single rate to charge everyone. In the past, that's always been because it was easier for customers to understand and for the utility to administer. It's
For commodity only.
I'm sorry?
For commodity only. For commodity only, do we have the same charge? The meter charge, the customer charge, the costs associated with the customer charge, so those fixed costs that I talked about, the distribution infrastructure, that's charged by meter size. Then outside of that, you've got a commodity rate that typically is charged the same rate. And you're right, that's called rate averaging. I mean, you take the average of the class, let's just say it's 4.5 or 4,000 gallons. We're going to design that rate based on that 4,000 gallon average. Same thing with electric at 750 kilowatt hours a month, whatever that may be.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think we agree we understand what we're talking about for rate averaging.
Yeah, okay.
I'm not aware, and the board in the past has never articulated a basis for making the rate differential distinction. Therefore, it's my understanding, even though costs vary within, say, the city, depending upon how close you are to the well fields or how close you are to a transformer or whatever, everybody still is charged the same rate for service within the city. So I don't really understand how using investor-owned utility concepts, if we rate average, how the board can still continue to justify a rate that's separate for customers within its service area that reside outside of the municipal boundaries. And the risk premium justification in the past is fallacious. And I can go into that as well.
Because typically, Robert, here's another school of thought here. Typically, the lot sizes are larger outside the city. There's more distribution infrastructure, 1. 2, typically, right now, I'm talking generalizations, the city has a more built out infrastructure in the city, meaning homes. There's not a lot of growth. Now, outside of the city, you typically see more growth. There's larger growth outside the city. So now If it's a full retail customer, if the outside city customer is a full retail customer, the utility's investing more money right now outside the city due to growth. And if they have to repair more in the future, there's larger infrastructure, longer infrastructure per customer, typically outside the city because the lots are larger. There's still justification to do it, even using rate averaging, because when we use rate averaging, we're averaging the rate inside the city. We're using rate averaging outside the city, but the differential is in that rate of return. Okay, and the rate of return recoups mainly that risk we talked about. Now, I know, Robert, before you've said there aren't any risk. Okay, so then there's another part of the cost of service study where we can look at the customer factor, if you will, it's called, where I might allocate the distribution mains. I'm just giving you a super simple example. Inside the city, I might give it a 1. Outside of the city, I might give it a 2 because the lot sizes are different. Maybe inside city lots are 50 by 100. Maybe outside of the city, they're 100 by 100. I don't know exactly what it is, but you can envision the distribution infrastructure on a larger lot is more. So you still have that justification to do it. I'm saying the justification is there. Whether you continue that practice is up to you guys.
Well, I believe that there are a lot of new developments adjacent to the city that probably have the same size, if not smaller than some of the lots within the city. I just continue to raise the issue and challenge the board. Is it unjustly discriminatory? And is it fair to continue this practice, which in your review of the cost of service work done previously and the last cost of service study that you did 5 or 6 years ago, did you see any quantification of this factor of lot size that would allow you to justify in your mind charging a different rate?
So Robert, in general, there's a lot of assumptions, a lot of educated assumptions that go into a cost of service study. When I see a 145 multiplier, I'm not alarmed, right? I might not get into that kind of detail in the study. If I were to see a 2, like I have clients that I'm working on doing that exactly, I'm alarmed. I know that number is not a 2. When I have a client fall between maybe 1.3 and 1.6, I don't push that as hard because I'm sure if I did a cost of service, let's just pretend I did a cost of service study. And I found out that multiplier is a 1.3 and you're multiplying a 1.45. 1.45 is the multiplier. The incremental difference there, sure, over time, I'm not saying there is no difference, but it's not material enough to create a rate challenge in general. You're asking awesome questions, but the differential isn't so alarming that I would raise a red flag there in general.
Hey, Dawn,
Robert,
I've got a question just based on what you've said. So if there are 2 developments on Park Road, Park Avenue, whatever it's called, one's in the city technically and one's out of the city technically, and they're right next to each other. If one annexes in, they get the lower rates.
Right.
If they don't annex in, they don't get the lower rates.
And that brings up another great point because and I don't know Delaware law, and I think, Robert, you've corrected me on this before, but the outside city customers could all decide to band together and have their own water plant or have their own wastewater plant. And then where does that leave the city?
They could not.
So that's one of many that I've covered areas that we look at. So, but you're correct. Your statement was if one's inside the city and one's outside the city, but they're still next to each other, yes, they're going to pay 2 different rates.
But if
But you
they're
got to remember,
But if they're out of the city, while Robert's right, that they can't form their own utility, they could go to the county for wastewater. To Artesian.
exactly, they could go to a different,
They could
Exactly.
go to another utility they would,
I disagree.
You're
with
absolutely
that. I
correct.
disagree with that assertion.
it's not that we're withholding utilities that would impact the ability to develop.
Now, let's be clear. I'm asserting that that statement is factually and legally incorrect. It's my understanding that wastewater service territories have been assigned based upon agreements between the county and Sussex County and municipalities. That's the case with the BPW. An electric customer outside the city and a water customer outside the city take service under certificates of public convenience and necessity from the State Public Service Commission. If a person wants to leave the service territory of the BPW, the property continues to be served by BPW. They can certainly physically move, but the service to the property remains the BPW. So there is none of this rate risk to the BPW for service within our service territory for customers who physically move out of the service territory.
But
Hey,
you still
Robert,
have,
Robert,
Only within the
I don't want to,
CPTM.
I don't want to cut you off, but there's two more questions out there to be answered. Can we draw this to a close, do you think?
Sure, I maintain that it's discriminatory to charge different rates to customers within the BPW service territory. I ask the board to reconsider the current practice and make a uniform rate for all customers receiving the same service within your service territory. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Appreciate it, as always. Okay, I think Tim has a couple of questions.
Yeah, so Tim's question, since he posed it, I think it would just be like an answer. Has there been any
I
effort?
did allow him to talk now, so if he wanted to speak for himself.
Tim, you're
Either
on mute. There you go.
You know what? I've submitted my questions and I'll let Austin read them aloud. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So the first question is, has there been any effort to align residential accounts with occupancy versus the residential properties that are occupied and used by commercial-based weekly rentals, possibly a separate rate?
okay, that's a good question. Are you talking like a short-term rental?
I
Yes.
think seasonal rentals.
Okay, like seasonal rental? Well, it depends how you classify we put customers in classes based on theoretical homogeneous usage. So just because somebody is renting a property, if the city views that as a commercial entity, then of course they would go on the commercial rate. But what we've classified, I mean, if it's a rental in general, they're going to typically use it like a residential customer would. So it's up to the utility how they view that customer. The key here is charging based on homogeneous usage. That's what the rate concern is looking at. We don't care, I mean, as far as okay, it's a home, but now they're renting it. Is that really a commercial account? That's you know, even if it's a weekly or long-term rental, it depends how the utility views that. But the rates are set up for homogeneous usage. Do you feel like the short or long-term rental uses usage patterns so much differently than a home, like it's intended to be occupied? That's a whole different question. You can actually look at that, by the way, looking at your billing statistics. What's the average usage for a weekly rental versus average usage for a homeowner?
Two things. First, I want to go back and correct myself. I do understand what Robert was saying about service territories. So I do acknowledge that. Second, now what Tim's question is here, I think what he's getting to is some of our neighboring towns have had them, you know, people tearing down houses and building what are essentially mini apartment blocks and renting to, and, you know, that can accommodate 20 people. But it's considered a, you know, a residence.
If you have your rate structure set properly, it won't matter. If you've got your customer charge set properly and your variable cost recovery, if you have 20 people in a building, they're going to use more water, right? Now, that particular one unit uses more water. And if there were a whole bunch of those, it would throw off that average rate making like Robert and I talked about before, because everybody would, instead of having an average, say 6,000 gallons a month usage that the residential rate is based on, that might move to 10,000 gallons a month. You're going to think of it as a bell curve, right? In any rate class, you've got some using less, you've got some using more, but we're looking at that bell curve and making the rate at that majority. Now, if there's a whole lot of these homes and that bell curve shifts, then the rate will shift with it. But if we've just got one unit we're worried about, if we've got the customer charge set properly and the variable commodity charge set properly, that 20-person place is going to pay more. You're going to get proper cost recovery if the rates are set properly.
And I agree with you. And I think we don't have the prevalence that our neighboring town has with this right now. It's just of a concern as we move forward. There probably are a handful of these properties that exist in Lewis, as opposed to what's happened in neighboring towns. Ted, I don't know, would you agree with that statement? Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that at this point.
Yeah.
Although it could shift.
Yes.
And then there was one other comment that Tim made, and I believe this goes back to Robert's discussion, which is using lot size is a questionable metric to justify a higher rate. The homes built on those larger lots located outside the city are much larger than those constructed on smaller lots in the city.
Right. And we don't care about that as long as our rate is set properly. If it's a larger home, you guys didn't put a 5/8 inch meter on there, you put a 1-inch meter on there. So they're going to pay more. If they're a larger home, they're going to use 10,000 gallons a month instead of 6,000 gallons a month. And if our rates are set properly, we're going to recoup that variable cost on that 10,000 usage.
That's all that was in the Q&A.
Okay. Dawn, do you have anything else to add? I know Austin has to compare our rates to others around. So if you're finished, we'll have Austin. Or do you
Yes,
have more? Yeah.
thank you guys for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for yours.
Do you want me to stick around, Austin? I have another one at 3, but do you want me to stick around for about 8 minutes here?
No, you should be fine. This is just taking what our rates are, what the proposed is, and comparing them to neighboring utilities.
Okay, well, I'm going to hang on for 6 more minutes in case you need me.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All right.
Thank you very much, Dawn.
Thank
Excellent
you.
as usual.
Thank you.
So this just is basically taking a look at what Dawn pretty much presented on. And at the bottom here, you can see the comparison, like our standard is a 5/8 inch meter versus a 1-inch meter that Rehoboth uses. So what the current BPW, and you can see this highlighted in yellow, you got $21.40. That's a typical 4,000 gallon bill. With the proposed, it's $25.40. Comparing it to Rehoboth, it's $35.76, and then Milton, it's $27.33. Now, taking a look at Milton is a quarterly. So basically, I just broke it up into what the $40 would be at a quarterly, and then their consumption rate was $3.50 per 1,000 gallons. Again, looking at Rehoboth, they're lower on the ready to serve side, but then they're charging $6.30. Again, it's all based on what they have on their website. 2 different methodologies, similar to what Dawn said, is that, our ready to serve is higher while our commodity is lower, versus Rehoboth, which takes into a kind of the opposite effect, where their ready to serve is rather low while their commodity is rather high. And you can see that a little bit more prevalent on the sewer side. Again, before and after, and then also looking at Rehoboth. Again, Rehoboth, I believe, is the same thing. I think it's $14 per 1,000 gallons versus what's being proposed for us, which is $6.01 on the new rate. So that's just kind of a quick and dirty on what we have on the water and sewer. And then I'm just going to bring up one other. And this is just to give a comparison that's published. And this just takes a look at all the utilities across the state that are part of DMEC. So obviously you can see Lewis towards the top there. Like Dawn had mentioned, when you're talking about an increase, you took $2.50, it still puts us in the top 4 within the state. And you can see as you go down, I mean, Electric Co-op investor owned, Delmarva investor owned, and then the rest are all municipalities. So that's just a comparison. Again, this is just showing you where we are currently and adding in the factor of, you know, what these changes, where we're going to look, where it's going to look like in the future. Again, when you're looking at this comparison, this is taken into account that nobody changes their rate. So with us and seeing our reaction to inflation, our reaction to the cost of goods, the cost of manpower and labor, other municipalities are facing the same thing. So their reaction would have to be, or what I would assume would be very similar to ours.
Thank you, Austin. Any questions? I just unfortunately just noticed that Nick Roth had clicked off just before that presentation. So Austin, make sure you would send that information to him, because I think that's what he's going to be looking for. I appreciate it. Of course, we can't vote on this today. In fact, you know, we have to discuss this at a board meeting and decide what changes, if any, we need to do, or maybe send it back to Dawn. I don't know. Hopefully that doesn't have to happen again, but so we've got our work to do. But I guess unless anybody has any additional comments or questions, we'll close this out, and we're going to go into executive session. So
I'd just like to say thank you to Dawn, because, you know, as I took on this role and had to learn and adapt, she's helped me. She's taught me in different things that I didn't know. And so we continue to work through it, and her adjustments to what we had back in July to where we are today. And I appreciate that.
Well, it's my pleasure.
I think that goes for all of us. You've done a really yeoman's job doing this. You've gone through it several times with us, and I think we're at a really good place right now. Thank you for everything.
Thank you. It's my pleasure working with you guys. Thank you. I'm going to jump off to another call now. Thanks, you
Okay,
guys.
thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Dawn.
Bye-bye.
So I'll need a motion to go into executive session.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
All in favor? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Everybody.